As Kay said, I'm Ariel. I'm an economist at Carnegie Mellon. This is joint work with my colleague in the business school, Brian Rutledge, and a grad student of ours, Yikang Shen. I'm really grateful to the organizers for putting together the workshop. I think it's great to get to hear economists and computer scientists and computer engineers come together and try to solve some real world problems in this space. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to present. As with the last two papers, this is a paper about liquidity provision on decentralized exchanges. You know, I don't think I'm taking a leap when I say the conventional view of providing liquidity on a DEX is perceived generally as a passive activity. So if you go to Uniswap or Curve, they say it's a way to earn passive income. If you ask your favorite large language model to explain DEX liquidity provision, it's going to say it's a passive activity. The research pioneered in part by CMAC and Tim and some of the others in this room, we typically think about this as an activity where you post liquidity to a decentralized exchange. You come back sometime later and get back your liquidity tokens, hopefully with some fees, of course, subject to some risk, adverse selection, impermanent loss, the opportunity cost of not arbitraging opportunities through that time while you staked your tokens. And what our paper does, though, is it's going to say, well, how passive is liquidity provision? Is it this passive activity where all price discovery happens somewhere else and liquidity providers don't play an active role in determining DEX pricing? And so the first component of our paper is empirics. I'm going to try to argue to you that actually a subset of liquidity providers are quite active. And by active, what I mean is they undertake transactions that directly control or modify the implicit prices we observe on automated markets. So in that sense, we don't think at least all LPs are necessarily passive. And the second half of the paper is to take that view and say, well, if I can write down a model where liquidity providers themselves have a role to manage prices on DEXs, what does their behavior optimally look like? And we'll do this sort of in a way that looks like V2, just because I think this liquidity activism of liquidity providers is a little more surprising. We'll then use the model to understand a little bit better, as I said, their behavior and a few features of optimal DEX curves. I think on the optimality, we end up getting some results quite close to some of Tim and CMAC's work, and so I may not emphasize that quite a bit. We just come at it from a different perspective. So let me jump right in and show you what we mean by active liquidity management. When I think about passive, I think about two things. One, it's a statement that liquidity providers interact with AMM smart contracts infrequently. Second is that they don't manage prices. They only use deposit, withdraw, mint, burn functionality of AMMs. And so I want to ask, what does the data say? So I'm going to focus on the 24 largest Uniswap V2 pools over the first half of 2023. And I'm going to take the most naive, simple approach to asking this question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at addresses that either mint or burn or own LP tokens. By definition, these are liquidity providers. And I want to ask, when I look at this address that is a liquidity provider, do they only use the mint or burn functionality? And that's important because in Uniswap V2, these functions in the smart contract are defined to force you to supply liquidity or withdraw liquidity in equal proportion to what is currently in the pool. By definition, that action does not impact the marginal price, the slope at the point on this curve. I want to ask, do liquidity providers swap against their own liquidity? Now, this is a bit naive, right? Because we know an address is not a person. You might think I have to do serious forensics to identify if individuals are using multiple addresses to do it. I'm going to do the simplest thing and assume an address is a person and see what I can find. And so first, let me just show you some data. So on the left, again, a liquidity provider address is an address that mints or burns liquidity to one of these pools. If you're a liquidity taker only, it means you have not minted or burned liquidity. You've made no deposits or withdrawals. And what do you see? Liquidity takers trade most frequently. Liquidity providers trade relatively infrequently. Over this period, 1.2 million swap transactions for liquidity takers, 36,000 transactions for liquidity providers. They're not around all that much. So it's definitely true that liquidity providers have few interactions with the contract, especially relative to these liquidity takers. But I hope you also see right away here, liquidity providers do swap against their own liquidity. I have 36,000 total transactions by liquidity providers, 5,000 of them are swaps. They are trading against their own pool, even just looking simply at the data, treating addresses in a person. Now, there's heterogeneity here. It turns out some of our liquidity providers, and now I'm looking at a unique address, do no swap transactions. About half of our liquidity providers never engage in a swap. They only supply or withdraw liquidity, but about half of them often swap against their own liquidity. So in this sense, we're seeing some serious active liquidity providers' actions where they're managing prices.
So what time period is this?
This is the first half of 2023. Okay. Again, I think this is like a lower bound on how much liquidity providers swap against their own liquidity, because we're not looking at clustering addresses to figure out if an individual provider owns a bunch. Okay. When I look at the distribution on the x-axis here, I'm asking, as a fraction of all your liquidity provider activity, how much of your actions are swaps? You see some mass around 50%. So among our liquidity trader providers, a bunch of them do about as many swaps as total as liquidity providing actions. So there is some activism among a large number of these traders. And the last bit of the data I just want to show you to motivate our analysis, these tend to be bundled. What do I mean by that? If I look at I'm going to try to pair transactions when a mint or burn happens within a few minutes of a swap. And the most interesting line is this third line. What we see among a large number of these liquidity swap transactions by our liquidity providers is they tend to often swap against their pool and then mint or burn liquidity. What does this mean? If you're a liquidity provider and you look at the DEX that you want to supply liquidity to and you think the implicit price on the DEX is wrong, the way to fix the price is not to mint liquidity to a new price point, because you don't get rewarded for that when you mint liquidity. You only get a fraction of the pool that you supply in equal proportion to what's currently in the pool. So what are these liquidity providers doing? They're trading up or down the exchange to the point where they think the price ratio is correct and then supplying more liquidity. And we're seeing that quite clearly in the data. So I take this as a statement that liquidity providers have their own perspective on what the right price on the DEX should be, and they take actions definitively to institute that price before supplying liquidity. So given that motivation, I want to write down a dynamic model where liquidity providers have a reason to set prices on the exchange. And to do that, I need to walk away from this conventional paradigm that all price discovery happens on a centralized exchange and gets instantly arbitraged against the DEX all the time by arbitrageurs. So that's what we're going to write down. The reason the paper is called Automated Exchange Economies is because the first model of financial or any asset exchange you learn in first year PhD economics is Edgeworth-Box economics, exchange economics. And so we're seeing how that applies in this setting. So I'm going to write down a 2x2 economy. By that, I mean I have two agents and two assets in finite time. My agents I'll assume are risk neutral. Think about a liquidity provider, perhaps Alice, who owns some endowment of a pair of tokens, A and B. She's going to think about supplying liquidity to a pool. Bob, our liquidity taker, can trade using this AMM. In your mind, I want you to think about a large number of such Bobs arriving every period. What's going to happen within a period? Our liquidity provider will choose to make a deposit. They can choose what deposit, what tokens to put on the exchange. After that point, public information about the assets is realized. We learn something. Did the asset value update or not? And then trade may happen. Bob comes along and may trade. And again, in the background, I'm going to make this implicit assumption that there's no perfect arbitrage at every instant between some infinitely deep limit order book market and our DEX. I'll show you exactly where that assumption comes to role. That's important because without that assumption, if you have this perfect correct price and our liquidity provider supplies at some distinct price, it instantly gets arbitraged again. The data tell us they do this, so we're going to take the perspective that that doesn't happen at least all the time. So those are my agents. What do we think about these tokens? We have tokens A and B. They're going to yield some terminal value, some terminal flow service, dividend, DIT. What happens at every period T is we learn some information about this dividend, YIT. We're writing effectively a binomial or trinomial process. Every period we learn something Y. It could be good news, the service flow goes up. It could be bad news, the service flow goes down. It could be no news, the service flow is constant. And then at the end, there's some residual uncertainty, epsilon, just to clean things up. So again, the news in each period is Y that arrives in each period. It can be up, down, or it can be the same. What matters here is the beginning of period beliefs, mu IT. So this is symmetric across everyone. Beginning of period, everyone has symmetric beliefs, mu IT, about the value of a given token in expectation. When our liquidity provider makes their deposits, she does so under her expected valuation, mu IT. I'm putting that in blue. Alice says, this is what I think these tokens are worth. Again, we started this paper, we thought, what would a DEX look like on the moon in the absence of Binance? We live in a world, people just have heterogeneous valuations about these assets. It is what it is. This is Alice's beliefs about the terminal service flow about this asset. Then the liquidity taker comes, but they come after information has been realized. And so now we have heterogeneous beliefs in principle. And there are two sources of heterogeneity. It could be we learn some information. Bob's beliefs mu hat are different because of the term in red. Notice the term in blue has the expectation at the start of time t. The term in red has the expectation after the information in that period's been realized. So if there's an up or down shock to the value of this asset, this is news. Alice has a stale price. She quoted under some stale beliefs. Bob has some better information. We'll trade against Alice. That's bad news. That's the standard view of adverse selection we've seen in this literature. What we're going to add, though, is a noise trading assumption in green, which is it could be there's no news. The term in red is identical to the term in blue, but Bob is coming along and just has some private heterogeneous valuation for the asset. Now there are gains to trade in this market. And again, unlike the existing literature, the conventional view, we're going to assume even if Bob trades for his idiosyncratic tastes in green, that won't instantly be arbitraged away by some separate arbitrager. In this case, Alice actually gets to capture realized gains to trade. And so that's the whole model. I'm not really going to show you much more because I'm short time. Our liquidity provider here very clearly is going to trade off losses from informed trading in red against gains from potential noise trading in green. And this all stems from this assumption that there isn't perfect costless arbitrage. If you like, in periods where news is realized in red, that's where an arbitrager is present. And when not, that's where there's some actual gains to trade. And so we're going to write down that kind of a model. I can show you some Bellman equations. The model actually works quite smoothly in dynamic time, so we can solve for this. I think what's more interesting is this simple idea. If I write down the one-shot version of this model, and again, here we're getting something very close to Tim and CMAC's paper on the Myersonian view of how to design DEXs. What you're going to have here is a liquidity provider who says, well, I have this term where I'm going to earn some profits on the uninformed traders. Pi is the probability there's no news and there's going to be some uninformed trade. I'm going to lose negative profits. This is this gamma I on informed traders. And those scale the terms that depend on how much liquidity I supply to the market. What I want you to see here is that I'm going to the extent liquidity provision is profitable, the uninformed trading is profitable enough or a high enough probability, I'm going to earn according to how much liquidity I supply to this market. But I'm going to suffer a loss to the extent I supply liquidity differently from my equal valuation. I now know whose valuation I should be applying. And so what does this model tell me? I should only supply liquidity if the gains are large enough. So I think I have enough uninformed trade. When there are gains to supplying liquidity, meaning the profits I earn on these uninformed trades are large enough, you can see from this simple optimality condition, the simple objective of our liquidity supplier, the conventional wisdom, you should supply liquidity in equal values can't be optimal. Why? Because if I depart from equal values a little bit, mu A, EA, my belief about the value of tokens I supply of A, and the belief about the token of the values I supply in B, if those are equal and I deviate a little bit, I suffer a second order loss, but a first order gain, because I'm supplying and creating more liquidity. So if we take the view that there isn't perfect arbitrage with Binance all the time, this conventional wisdom, supply deposits in equal value, no longer holds. So I revise this wisdom that says, deposit in equal value only if there are no gains to trade in the market. This conventional view is only useful to the extent you believe there's no value in the market. If you believe there are gains to trade, some deviations from that, and it's a quantitative question how far you want to move, should emerge. The last bit, this is a hideous proposition, don't read it. I just want to make one point. We have a model with linear preferences. It's unsurprising you're going to push people to corners. Liquidity provider is going to want to supply all of A or all of B. What that means is in a dynamic model, and this comes out, there's going to be inertia in liquidity providers' behavior. They might be at a corner, they'll observe some trades occur. They may not want to react right away because they're going to be stuck at the same corner. So our model in a dynamic sense will endogenously generate this infrequent activity. Now that's a leap. It comes from this assumption of risk neutrality with corner constraints. But if you're willing to give me some risk aversion and some cost to trade, like gas costs of adjusting my liquidity, we generate the same endogenous behavior. So I view this message as a little more robust than coming out of this linear model. I'm short time, and so to keep us back, I just want to say, what are the implications for the design? And again, here we have similarities from this model to some that exist in the literature, but it shows a similar trade-off, which is in some ways, if I just had uninformed trade, this is a model of heterogeneous beliefs with linear preferences. What do you want to do? Maximize volume of trade. If you have convex prices, like our constant function market makers do, all that does is limit trade of our liquidity takers. That's not good for our liquidity providers XN. It's not going to capture as much surplus as we can possibly get. Why is convexity to some degree useful? Well, of course, it offers some protection from informed trading. And so what the paper suggests is a more delicate trade-off between the optimal degree of convexity, and that's going to hinge, of course, on the amount of informed versus uninformed trading and the extent of heterogeneity in the beliefs that we're willing to tolerate. In some sense, how volatile are potential beliefs over Ethereum. So let me just wrap up. First part of the paper is trying to document active liquidity provision in Uniswap markets. Again, in V3, where we ask liquidity providers to tell us the prices they want to trade at, we see they're a bit active. But even in V2, where it seems there's no scope for liquidity provider activism, we find clear evidence of that without doing anything complex, any interesting forensics. I'm willing to bet there's more if we did it. I just find it interesting we see it without having to do that. Using that motivation, we built a dynamic theory of active liquidity provision. We show if there are limits to arbitrage with a centralized exchange, then we should expect and actually encourage liquidity providers to deviate from this quote unquote equal value rule we've all seen. Our paper shows that globally linear prices are typically suboptimal because they don't offer enough protection from adverse selection. And where we're headed is, as I said, pushing the dynamic model a bit more to look to these empirics. How much inertia do we get in liquidity provider behavior? Can we generate that endogenously with some sensible numbers? And more broadly, which I think is an open question for future work, who knows, like taking seriously, who knows what the value or the distribution over possible values of these tokens may be? If you have concerns about robust mechanism design, what does that look like in this space? And so we think our framework is amenable to that analysis. We're hoping to push in that direction. All right, thanks very much for your time.